questions at the end in the chat window. So today we are going to talk about branding and marketing for small organizations. This is something that you can really get a lot of mileage out of in terms of how the public perceives the work you're doing and how you're able to get the word out about events and things like that are coming up. We'll go through some tricks and some tips when you're kind of creating a brand a little bit from scratch, or from taking a new brand and building things to reinforce it. And we'll also talk a little bit about some really low cost marketing strategies that can have a lot of impact. My background is in running small, mostly arts organizations on the East Coast. I've always had to do my own branding. I, in the early days, couldn't figure out how to raise enough money to hire a designer. That might be a familiar story for y'all. So I've had to kind of figure this out over a while, and I've been lucky to have some folks show me along the way how I can be more effective and impactful with the work that I'm doing, and how I'm engaging the community in that, and then have gone on to sort of teach some about this. So workshops like this I've done a number of times. So branding and marketing are actually pretty different things. I've taught classes and courses like this before, and actually spent a whole hour on branding, and I spent a whole hour on marketing. They get lumped together, but I think that the approach and the strategies are pretty different for them. Branding is how people see your organization and understand what you do. So this is visual elements. This is understanding kind of your mission and abstractly what the organization does. These are things that are constantly reinforced and have a lot to do with the visual identity of your organization. Marketing is taking that brand and positioning it in a way that you get awareness of work that you're doing, or are able to generate some sort of response and action. So, like buying a ticket or coming to an event or donating online. Those are all marketing things. Marketing gets down the road of sales. We talked about sales in the fundraising workshop, and more intentional actions in that funnel, taking people and moving sort of down the sales pipeline. For marketing, we're going to focus mostly on the awareness. Marketing and sales go together. Sales kind of comes after marketing, but when you're first sort of getting people used to what you're doing, that's what marketing is for. We're going to start with branding. I think branding is more fun to talk about. And there's some tools that I want to show you of how you can maximize your own branding without having to, have a design staff or pay a graphic designer. So again, this is what we're going to talk about: is how people understand your organization, understand what you do, and how you come across to the public. A lot of it is visual identity and how people perceive that you're having an impact in the community. So this idea of perception of value. This is how you build trust and credibility with the public. And as a new organization, or as a small organization, this is sort of a through line of all these talks is, how do you, if you're only one person or if you're a small group, how do you make it look like you're, much more advanced and sophisticated and have been around a long time and worthy of all this grant money? Branding can help you a lot with that, because how people experience sort of doing their research to check and see if an organization is legit or not usually doesn't go so far as to looking up their 990 history online or their tax filings, but certainly going to the website, looking at the social media, seeing how the emails are formatted. Those are things that really get you a lot of credibility and can put you down this road to make it look like you're more of a thing than you are. Not that we're not all going to get there someday, but branding is a great, cheap, low cost strategy to doing that. Some things to consider in the beginning. The golden rule of branding, I think, is consistency. So consistency, I think, consistency is more important than sort of objectively how good something looks. Even if, maybe your logo is not the most beautiful logo in the world, or your website and your color palette, is not, the most attractive thing in the world. The goal of branding is to get people to identify your values with your visual identity. So it doesn't really matter, I don't think, ultimately, objectively what it looks like, but that you're reinforcing that brand over and over and over, and that you're keeping, your fonts are always the same, your colors are always the same, your logo is always the same and is on everything. I think, consistency is really the name of the game in branding. The other golden rule of branding is repetition. So again, reinforcing the same message, the same color, the same logo, the same thing over and over and over. You can notice here, my logo shows up on these presentations all the time. You've probably even gotten so used to it that you forgot that it's there. This is, my color palette, my fonts, everything is sort of, staying consistent across website, emails, visual media, print media, things like that. So consistency and repetition are how you reinforce your brand, how you get people to ultimately recognize who you are and what you do based on your branding. Same message, same visuals, same colors, fonts everywhere. That's how this works, how you can look professional, how your funding applications, your sponsorship proposals will look better. Is this consistency and repetition in your branding? This is also kind of a through line. If you are starting out and just starting to kind of build a visual identity, find someone who's doing this well and kind of knock off what they're doing. This works really well especially for website layouts. If you want to, there's an organization that you sort of want to be like kind of when you grow up, look at what they're doing. Look at how they approach their color palettes, how they're, using photos to reinforce their mission work and what they're doing. There's also a lot of great blog and online resources for these sort of more design elements. Graphic designers love to write blogs about all kinds of stuff. This is an example of a website where they are posting work and talking about and having a dialogue about choices they made and style decisions and why they made that and what they're hoping to achieve with that. So Dribbble is one. There's a lot of website references I'm going to give you in this presentation. And I might do kind of a summary thing later that just kind of lays them all out. For the branding section of this talk, we will focus on a couple elements, mostly visual, for building your brand. So logo and color palette. This is the key elements and sort of essence of how you can quickly convey who you are and what you're doing to your audience. Also fonts, being consistent with fonts and picking a font that can be representative and can be everywhere is really important. We'll do just a tiny bit on the website. We've got another workshop coming up on the 28th of this month that is all about technology and how technology can help support the work that we're doing. So just a little bit about technology. Business card. I think business card is a huge one, especially because in a lot of instances is your first visual brand representation. So if you're at a networking thing and you meet someone for the first time, this is kind of like your first entry into who you are as an organization, and what you're trying to accomplish. So I want to talk about business cards a little bit too. So for logo, logos, it's actually kind of challenging to define. It's a basic graphic that represents the name of the organization and is designed to create some sort of feeling and understanding about what kind of work that you're doing. It should be representative of your mission. If you are working in raising money for cancer awareness or something like that, that's a little bit more on the kind of stoic side of nonprofit work, maybe not a fun logo with balloons or something like that. So, a logo graphic representation that's roughly in line with your mission I personally like the idea of having a logo mark that can live independent of the full logo. For me at Tiny Opera House, I've got this little tiny opera house that's right here. So sometimes I use that all by itself. I like being able to split that out into different situations. There's arguments on both sides about whether there should be logo marks in your logo. I personally like doing that. It gives you more options for conveying and reinforcing your brand. Uh, your logo should be sized in a way that you can use it in a variety of places. So if you've got a logo that is really skinny and long, that's going to be hard, because if you have to put it on a business card, or if you have to put it on, if you're making an app, or how your website shows up on a phone, those are square icons a lot of times. So typically something close to a square works really well. Or if you've got kind of like we have this, more landscape size logo. The logo mark is a square, and that's intentional, so that in instances where we need to use a square kind of icon logo, that we have options for that. If you don't have a logo yet, there are a lot of great options for having people do this pretty cheaply. Two of the ones that I know that folks have used and that I've used myself. One is called Fiverr.com. This is kind of a like a marketplace for professionals of all kinds to do kind of short project work. And some of those are graphic designers, so you can get a logo for fairly cheap. There's also a thing called 99 Designs that you can create a little competition to have designers propose ideas for you. So a couple options if you haven't already gotten a logo. There's also ones now. There are these crazy like AI computer websites. One is called Logo Joy. I'll pull that up in a second. Where it'll build a logo kind of just by you saying roughly what colors you like and kind of what feel you want to create with the logo. So those are good options too. Yeah, and we'll circle back to questions if you got specific things about logos that you want to talk about. Color palette. So color palette a lot of times starts with the logos. This is your assortment of colors that you're able to use that kind of go together. The colors look nice together. You can alternate. I'm sure if you've been in these presentations, you've seen that I kind of alternate in our color palette a lot. I use this orange, I'll go back to purple, but always the same colors, always the same options. But it helps kind of provide some vibrancy, make it a little bit interesting, and again give you more options for what you're representing visually. There are some psychographics. I don't know if this is the right use of the term. It's the biggest word I have in the presentation, so I wanted to put it somewhere. Taupe is supposed to be calming, and gray is supposed to be professional, and red is supposed to represent vitality. There's some resources you can look at online if you want to go down that road, or if that sounds like something that would be important to you and your brand as you're designing it. Picking a color that is something that reinforces the mission. If you've got a calming mission, if you've got a vibrant mission, how can the color selection reinforce that? RGB and hex. This is when you're doing any of this stuff on a computer. How colors are represented in computer programs are either through this thing called RBG or a hex code. And I'm going to show you a little bit of an example of how these things work. And I also want to introduce you to the Medicine Dropper. If you have not met this tool, this is a tool that lives in Microsoft Paint. If you're on a Windows computer, I'm sure there's something really great and fancy in Apple that has a dropper. I don't know what it is. I've always just had Microsoft computers. I'm not cool enough to have Apple computers. But the Medicine Dropper makes it possible for you to replicate colors that show up on your computer screen. This is great for either using the elements of your brand, kind of pulling those colors out to show them in different ways. It's also great for kind of creating a color palette from the beginning. And this is something kind of I want to show you how this works. So I'm going to pull off this presentation for a second. I've got an example a little bit later on in the presentation that shows how this can work. But here's an example of, this is something I did for an art class a couple of years ago. If you don't have a program that you know of that has this medicine dropper tool, you can see I'm already kind of selected on it. There's an online tool you can use called Pixlr. It kind of looks like Photoshop if you've ever used Photoshop, or it kind of looks like Paint as well. What I want to show you in this is, this is the medicine dropper tool. This is called the color picker tool, but it always looks like this kind of medicine dropper. You can use this to basically suck up the colors that are in a picture. So if we wanted to build a color palette based on this image, or if we had our logo, you notice every time I click, this color changes right here. So that's how I can say, oh, if I use text that has this font, now I've got consistency with, this image, and then this color will create, down the road to having a consistent branding identity. So I'll show you a little bit more in a little bit how that works, but this is how you can suck that color up. If you click on it, this is where we're talking about RGB and hex. RGB, there are these letters right here. Things like Photoshop, or not Photoshop, PowerPoint, if you wanted to copy over this color into PowerPoint, you've got to enter these codes here. Other programs just use this, what's called a hex code. Then it's called that because there's 6, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 6 letters in that. So both ways that you can, replicate a color and use it, you can take this and use it in Microsoft Word, or create a PowerPoint, or create a PDF that has that. And again, that's down that road of consistency in your visual identity. All right. Okay. If you're looking at creating an entire color palette, there's a great tool out there called Peloton. And here's the Pixlr tool we just talked about. I'll show you how it works. So you can start with one color that you like and build a whole color palette. Colors have a lot of science to them in terms of what goes well together. And there's a great tool that we can take advantage of that I want to show you. So, okay, let's go back here. So this is where we started. We have our, image, or this is our logo, and we want to build a whole color palette around that. We suck this up. We take this hex code here. I'm just going to copy that. And I'm going to go over here to this website called Peloton. Peloton will build a color palette for us based just on the hex code of one color. So again, this becomes our main color, and we already can see all these different shades that we can use that all go together. And if you go up here, these are some of the different kind of sciencey ways to figure out colors that go together. So in just a few clicks, now we've got a purple that we can use, a dark purple that, might look good on a business card. Exploring a little bit more, there's some greens that kind of mathematically go together, as well as some brown tones. So this is a way you could build just from scratch, take one color and build a whole color palette. All of these, if you hover over them, will give you the hex code, and you can either copy these or write these down when you're in Microsoft Word, or in in a PowerPoint or something like that. This can become your color identity, which I think is pretty cool and pretty easy to create. Okay, and again, if you've got questions on color palette, just throw them in the chat window, and I'll look at it at the end and make sure that we talk about everything that y'all want to talk about. Fonts are another big part of visual identity. Fonts are something that I love to talk about. Anyone who's got I feel like all graphic design folks can geek out on fonts. Fonts is another one that, I've got my own personal opinions of what I like in a font. But really the name of the game is consistency and repetition. So, if you've got a font that you like, that you feel like matches your brand, that, that becomes the font that shows up on your website, on your business cards, on your proposals, on your PowerPoints. Um, Again, it's about consistency and having that across all the media that you're using. I personally, something that's clean lines and scalable, something you can read if it's small, something that you can read if it's big. There's going to be a lot of different situations where you're going to present text in graphic media. So something that's got a lot of really curly Q things. If you squish it down real small, you might not be able to read what the words are. So that's personally why I like the font that I have. There is a way that you can get fonts that match things that you print out. So things like, proposals in Microsoft Word or PowerPoints, and that also show up on the website. I'll show you that in just a second. This the whole world of Google fonts is, has come up in, I don't know, maybe the past 5 years or so, but it's, really the best way to go about this, again, because it gives you that consistency not only in print materials but in your web materials as well. When you are, if you picked your font, one thing that you're going to run into is that not everyone has the same fonts. So if you, let's say I was going to email this presentation to you in a PowerPoint format. If you open this and you don't have the font that I have, this computer will kind of come up with something that it thinks is close, but it takes away that, visual identity reinforcement that we're talking about so much. So in any of these Microsoft Office applications, there's a way to embed the fonts with the document. Something like a PDF is, great because it's basically like printing it out on a piece of paper. So whatever the font was, however it looked when you created the PDF, is how it's going to look forever. Other applications like PowerPoint's a great example, don't always have that. So before you send out any of these documents, if you're sharing them around, check to make sure that your fonts are selected to be embedded with that document. If you haven't chosen your favorite font, I would love to give you lots of advice because I love fonts. People also really like to write blogs about fonts. Google best font 2018, and there's going to be, 1,000 articles about it. I'll show you Google Fonts right now. Google Fonts is, I think, right now kind of the standard of how to do this, chiefly because of the ability to have your font consistent across web and print. Google Fonts, you can just type in Google Fonts into a search engine and it'll take you here. There's a lot of these fonts, so they've got some ways to narrow down. You have to find a font that you like. Again, I like to start by just Googling, best fonts 2018. I use a font called Roboto is my font that you see everywhere. And one of the big reasons why Google Fonts is so great is that in addition to being able to style this for your website, you can actually download this font so that you can use it in all of your Office applications, all of your print materials as well. So here, here's where you can download the fonts. And if you need help with that, just Google how to install fonts on your computer. And then this becomes how you can, in your website, and again, we'll talk about this more on the 28th, but how you can make sure the fonts on your website match the fonts that you have in print. So Google Fonts is, I think, I don't know anywhere else that's that easy. And they're all free. It's their, open source. So if you haven't picked a font, I highly recommend spending some time with Google Fonts. Okay, website. So website, again, we're going to talk more about this on the 28th. Most of how we're going to approach building a website is with the idea that you don't have a lot of money to pay a web developer. I think websites are one of these things. If you don't know how to run your own website, I think you just kind of have to learn how to do it. I don't know that there's anything that you get more value out of the learning curve of figuring out how Squarespace or how WordPress works than website, because this is how the online world experiences you. You want to have the information updated constantly. And if you're relying on someone else to do that, it can get really expensive, and it can, you get someone's cousin's friend who does it for free, and they do it for 2 months and they leave and they got the passwords for it. I've seen so many mess situations with kind of outside web services when you're at a level that you can't really pay for it. So again, we'll go through that in more detail on the 28th. I do think it's really important, though, and I wanted to say this again down the road of consistency in branding, is setting up your website domain so that you can have that as your email as well. I see a lot of personal Gmail addresses that get attached to grant forms, and it really kind of dings you in your professionalism. If you want to look like you're a bigger deal and more successful and more worthy of funding than maybe you are at this point, that's a good, easy trick to make it happen. Business cards. So business cards, again, I think, it's a little old school, but I think is still really important. It does provide the first visual touch point with someone. If you're having a conversation or you meet someone out that might be able to help the organization. So I think it's worth the time to build something that looks nice. In my personal opinion of how to approach business cards, full color, they're not expensive to make. I always upgrade for the heavier card stock. When I get someone's business card, I sort of out of a habit will flick it just to see how thick it is. And for some reason in my brain, a thicker card means somebody who's more serious about what they're doing. So I always pay for more the heavier card stock. I like to keep not a lot of information on business cards that I use. So then I have room to write down information or notes about somebody, or if there's an event coming up, I can write the date on there. It gives me some options in terms of not just giving the card and always having to use the same information on it. There are a lot of online companies that do printing for business cards. Vistaprint's been around for a long time. There's something called Moo, overnight prints I've used. One thing that I think is really helpful and can save you some money is all of these companies. If you Google like Vistaprint coupon, they almost always have like a 40% or 50% off business cards coupon that you can find the code for online. So as an easy trick to save 20 or 30 bucks if you are looking to print new business cards or looking to do business cards for the first time. I would start with overnight prints coupon code or Vistaprint coupon code, just to see what comes up and what kind of deals you can get. I'm going to use this business card concept as a way to kind of show how you can do a whole strategy around branding with some of the tools that we've looked at today already. So let's say we're going to start with this image. Again, this is something I did for an arts class. This was somebody's piece that they had in the class. So if this becomes our representative image, we take that, we use our medicine dropper tool, we pull out one of the colors from it. In this case, we got a nice, beigey purple looking thing. From that one color, of course, now we know how to build a full color palette using our online tool at Peloton. Now we need a font for our business card. Again, Roboto is the one I'm using right now, so we'll use this as an example. This little font block, this is a thing people who write font blogs, they like to do little font things and have, obscure but not really that obscure quotes. Anyone know what this one is? I'm not going to tell you. You probably know. Creating the back, picking one of these cards. In this case, I, picked a dark image, a dark color so that it looks, it looks kind of good together. And then something minimal. a tagline up here, some information down here, and that's a pretty solid looking business card that only takes a couple steps to make. Another alternative that I like, and this is actually how my business card looks, is having, if you've got a logo that looks nice on a business card. This is why I have a logo that is slightly landscape shaped with, of course, a logo mark that's square, so I can use that if I need a square thing, is so that I just have the logo. The whole logo is one side. And then in this case, I do white as the other side, again, because then it's easy to write here. If I need to give someone a card and write down, remind them where they met me or kind of what help I'm looking for from them, I can do that. So that's kind of bringing a couple of things we talked about all together, and showing how it can be helpful in a pseudo real life situation. A couple other thoughts before we talk about marketing. There are ways in any of the Microsoft Office apps, or I'm sure in whatever the equivalent of Apple productivity apps. There's ways to set defaults. Once you've got your font picked out and your color palette picked out, I think it's a great idea to then go in and set those as your default settings in your Office applications. That way, every time you open up a Word document or open up a PowerPoint, it's got your color palette, it's got your font, and already kind of defaults to the things that reinforce your brand. Will save you time and keep a check on yourself that you're always being consistent when you're producing any of these documents. One thing that we could do a whole hour just on this, and I've done that before. If it sounds like something interesting to y'all, we can see about getting it on the schedule. Is how you talk about your organization is part of your branding identity. Most of what we've talked about so far is on the visual identity side, so graphics and fonts and logos and all that stuff. But how you represent the mission of the organization is also a really important part of your branding. And the same rules apply: the consistency, the reinforcing, that your mission statement, as you say it, you kind of say the same thing every time you talk about the mission. It's the same words. Are really helpful ways to reinforce that value proposition component of brand identity. If you're just starting out, I think there's a couple ones that are really helpful to have under your belt. And these are things that you write down, you practice, you take them and run them by your friends to make sure they make sense. I do this all the time with Tiny Opera House, to make sure that I'm conveying what we do and how we do it. If I have, 20 seconds is sort of an elevator pitch. If I'm going to talk about it for a minute, that's more of a, kind of the full mission statement. Or if I'm just putting it on the side of a business card, how do I have, 10 words that convey everything that I'm trying to do with this organization? It's hard, and it's hard to distill that, and it's hard to keep on message with that. So this is worth spending time on and worth, writing it down, standing in front of the mirror, all that sort of dorky stuff, so that you can, someone says, "Oh, what do you do?" That you've got, depending on the situation, a variety of pre-canned, pre-tested, language blurbs you can drop. This is something you can get into. It's sort of complicated, but fun to spend time on. There are a lot of ways that you can, if you see someone's website and they've got all these great photos and it looks, like their meetings are so great and the people are so great. A lot of times these are just things that you buy. I'll show you in a second kind of how much is actually available in terms of graphic media that you can just purchase. So stock photos is one of that. I'll show you some other things that I think are more helpful. I do just wanted to put in here so that it's a reference point. When you are sending out images or logos for, depending on what your source is, the density of the pixels or how sort of high res they are is really important. Basic rule of thumb standard is 72 dpi is how big you need a web image to look, for it to look good. We're sending a font out to be printed. it of course needs to be a lot higher, and 300 is kind of that threshold for how big the image needs to be. So this is something that I don't want to spend a ton of time on, but I wanted to be here as a reference, how you can scale up to having kind of nothing for visual identity to a whole suite, all the way down to document templates and things like that. You just kind of buy a lot of this stuff. It seems like there's a big mystery with graphic design, and how did someone create a cool template like that, or create a PowerPoint presentation that looks nice. There's actually not a lot of rocket science to it. You can even start off. There are things called style guides that you can buy for. I think I got mine for $10, and it has the fonts and it has the color palette already picked out. Things like Fiverr and 99 Designs we talked about. If you need a logo, getting a website, once you kind of have a style guide, pick a template that they offer that kind of matches that aesthetic. Business cards, we talked about that. How do you use your logo in the style guide to make a business card that looks good? And then this is something I want to show you quick. There's a marketplace called Graphic River that offers a fairly astounding amount of graphic media that you could just kind of buy. So let's say I needed a PowerPoint presentation. I don't have to build the slides from scratch to make it look great. I could just buy, depending on the website loads, spend $15 or $20 and have a really great template that really makes it look, again, like I'm a real professional big organization. Well, anyways, it's loading a little slow, but Graphic River was worth checking out. Again, look, you can get really great looking templates. They're all just so cheap. Like PowerPoint presentation has all of these slides. The same thing with reports and materials like that, print items. It's worth spending some time looking at all the different things you can buy from here. Okay, that's all I'm going to talk about for branding. And then now we'll move on to marketing. So once you have a visual identity, you have a brand, you've got your value proposition and your pitches down, how do you use that and leverage those things to get the word out about your organization, the work that you're doing, and continue to build that audience, continue to build your prospects and new donors, new contributors, new event participants. From a small organization standpoint, I think the best leverage that you have is you can create a lot more impact. And I, as a numbers person, I always think about it as impact per dollar. You can create a lot of good in the world for a lot less money than something like the United Way or the Red Cross would be able to do, because they've got pension payments they're paying people that worked there 30 years ago, and they've got giant overhead things. It's hard for them to have the level of authentic impact that you can have as a small organization. And nothing is better in marketing than having a good product. So, if you're not executing well on programs, and we're going to talk about program design next week and how to, really make sure that you're doing high value, high impact programs. If your programs are good and interesting and authentic and having that high impact return, it creates more of an incentive for people to want to talk about this. People love stories about, there was an organization I met with last week that it's a woman sort of all by herself. She hands out tampons to homeless women because she noticed that that's not something that they always have in shelters. And so she's out there kind of doing that on her own, spending a couple $1,000s just buying things from CVS like that. Those stories become very compelling, from a media perspective. So I think this is a great area to really lean into being small, because you've got some leverage and some uniqueness to what you're able to create as a sort of grassroots organization that that not everyone has. So I just want to kind of set the tone of that before we talk about the rest of it. Yeah, I mean, people, a lot of marketing is storytelling. Not just you telling the story of your organization, but other people telling stories about the work you're doing. Especially true in media and public relations standpoints, which we'll talk about. So know that that's a kind of leverage tool that you've got in your arsenal. Marketing. Of course, you can get a whole degree in marketing. So there's a ton to talk about. I'm going to talk about just a few kind of high impact, cheap or free marketing strategies for ways to get the word out. First of this is email marketing. If you're not doing this, using a kind of MailChimp or constant contact thing, you're missing out. It's free for a lot of these platforms. We'll talk about that. Social media, of course, is free if you've got the time investment to do it. There's so many people that do it well that it's hard to stand out these days. It used to be enough to just kind of have a Facebook page and post stuff on it. We'll talk a little bit about that. Public relations. This is one thing I'm going to give you a document that I think is really going to be helpful. It explains how to actually interact with the media in terms of press releases and things like that. That's kind of the best free marketing you can get is if someone's going to do a story about you in the paper or on the radio, on TV. Talk a little bit about content marketing. It's a way of kind of providing a little bit of a transactional quality to keep people coming out and being engaged with your organization. Email marketing. This is like MailChimp sending out newsletter sort of things, with photos of work that you're doing or upcoming events. The best part about email marketing is it creates a regular touch point with your supporters, so they have an opportunity to really feel like they're part of the work that you're doing, and that that they're kind of part of the family. Is the term I use. I like thinking of it as a family. These can be free. MailChimp is free up to I think 2,000 contacts and some sort of scheduled emails a month, so it can be free. Of course, everything free still has a cost in terms of time. MailChimp has a lot of great guides for this. I would say if you're new to email marketing, that's a good place to start. If you are new and you think, oh, how am I going to even build up an email list to communicate with? There's actually a way that if let's say you've got a Gmail account set up for your nonprofit, or your email is set up on your @nonprofit.org domain. You've got what is the Microsoft one? The Office email program. There's a way you can actually export contacts. So anyone that you've had email correspondence with in the context of the organization and the work that you're doing, I think there's an easy argument to be made that those are people you can put on a mailing list. There are a lot of rules now about giving people the opportunity to unsubscribe and making that easy. But I think as a starting point, if you're already engaged with these people in Gmail or somewhere like that, to export those lists, and that becomes kind of your starting point for having an email marketing program. And then getting in the habit of just collecting emails everywhere, having a business card drop at events, or putting on the website that there's email sign up for the newsletters. It's something you kind of have to constantly be working on to get people engaged. But nothing is better, nothing is easier, nothing is cheaper than having an email marketing component to your work. So I think it's kind of a must if you're not doing it already. Check the guides out on MailChimp. They're great and comprehensive. They talk in different industries too, which I think is really helpful. Social media, again, is kind of a must at this point. It is free, again, just like everything that's free from a cost perspective. It's not necessarily free from a time perspective. I'm going to refer you to some things that I'm actually going through right now with social media. HubSpot has a whole course kind of like this, a little bit, I would say maybe a lot fancier than these webinars that we're doing, but is great information, and a lot of it is just the discipline of doing it regularly. I mean, to stay relevant in social media, you have to do it all the time. It's not something I'm tremendously good at, so I'm trying to learn myself. So if you guys want to sign up for a class together, we can do that. One thing I do know and is in thinking about what platforms you want to be on, each one kind of has a different audience. So figuring out what your portfolio of platforms, I guess, if you've got Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and Instagram, the content that goes out to each of those has to be slightly different, which is again how this can take just a lot of time and a lot of intentionality and dedication to making sure that you're doing it. It's another area that you can find people who are really good at it and kind of copy what they're doing. What are organizations that you want to be like? What are they doing with their social media? And there's a lot of great options now, and it's been for a while, but to automate. So scheduling posts in advance. There's an article that you want to go out on Friday. You can do 2 hours in the morning on Monday and potentially schedule your whole week's worth of social media. I think that's how the pros do it. That's what HubSpot talks about. Again, that's their business, is this, kind of media automation. One thing that is also interesting is that in terms of low cost but high impact, the advertising platforms within social media have really easy to use and understand interfaces. It's something worth doing. Like if you've got an event and you just want more people to see it, they make it really easy for you to spend 10 or 15 bucks to get the word out about that. So it's something worth looking at if you haven't played around with Facebook ads or LinkedIn paid advertising. They can be really cheap and get you a really, really good return in terms of exposure for things you've got on social media. Public relations in the press. This is the best free marketing you can get, is stories written about your organization, you as a nonprofit leader, or the work that you're doing, or events that are coming up that you're hosting. There is a sort of standard way to communicate with members of the media that is not, I don't think, communicated very well. So I'm going to give you a guide that I wrote a couple years ago when I was doing a lot of press releases and a lot of kind of public engagement work. There are standards in that document about, what kind of language goes in the second paragraph, what goes in the first paragraph, what goes in the last paragraph. People in the media have a very short amount of time to look at every single thing. So if you can make it easy for them to run an article about what you're doing, that's really the goal, is to make it so they can just pull language from the press release, put it in print, and then you get that tremendous value of being listed in the paper or listed in a featured newsletter. And it doesn't cost you anything except a little bit of know-how. It even talks about building a press list. This is something that people kind of tend to be very protective over. Their email list that is all the media that they have relationships with. We've got some tips in that guide about how to do that if you haven't done this before. It's also, at the end of the day, just kind of like, not everything else, but a lot of what we talk about in terms of fundraising, in terms of, program design, even grant applications, there are human beings behind each of these institutions. So, it becomes a relationship game in a lot of these, and the working with the media is especially like this. Being familiar with the person who has the potential to push a story out about you is a really valuable thing. It takes a while to develop, but is really can be really helpful. I'm going to show you this guide just real quick, just to make sure that there's nothing I really want to highlight. We talk about the format, we talk about headers. There's a lot of nuances about what happens in media rooms, both in terms of, they can't always download images because it's a security threat for their system. So you have to send the images in a certain way. What paragraphs are supposed to be. There's a whole world of this second paragraph where this is kind of what you want to see in print. And if you do this well enough, they will just grab your second paragraph and put it in the story. If you give them a picture that they can use, there's best, some email practices. And then I've got a sample one that's from a while ago. It's an art event that I did. But it has these, kind of standard best practice things in it as an example. So I'll circulate this. I think it's really helpful. And again, as a small organization, you've got good stories that people want to talk about. So leveraging that when you're writing these is really key. Content marketing, and then we're almost done, then we'll do questions. I know we're running up close to 11. Content marketing is media that you create that has value to someone in your network or a consumer that you want to be familiar with your brand. These workshops that we do as part of Tiny Opera House, that's a good example of content marketing. I mean, these are things we do for free. It's important to me personally in my kind of individual mission and passion for helping small organizations. But it's also important for our business ultimately, which is, we're trying to produce software solutions to make a lot of this running of nonprofits easier. Because when you're just starting out, you don't really need a ton of tools, but you need some specific things and some good know-how, to be successful. And that's, ultimately for what I want to achieve in the world is to help give organizations a better chance of being successful when they're just starting out. So this is content marketing for us. We produce this content. We produce the press release. It provides value for folks who are engaging with our brand and our business. That create a reason for people to come back and keep checking in with us. The sales cycle, the marketing cycle, you never know where you're going to hit people in that. So creating a reason to continue a conversation with them is kind of what content marketing is about. This can, photos of things you're doing. It kind of can overlap with social media. It is, like everything else, can be free. Writing blog posts or writing stories is free. It just takes time, and it takes the intentionality of doing it and doing it regularly. But it is a great way to build relationships and to build a familiarity and a trust with your brand because you're creating some sort of value for the folks who are engaging with you. Ultimately, all of this marketing world and kind of how sales is getting as well. There's a lot of data sophistication that you can get, and we'll talk about this more on the 28th when we talk about sort of technology solutions to help make your jobs easier. But I think something that's kind of humbling and I think a good perspective, and I take this with myself as someone who has to grassroots market a lot. Marketing is all about the results that you're creating, right? So if I want people to come to an event, it doesn't really matter if I really like the flyer or if I really like the invitation or I really like how funny I was when I wrote the text on the Facebook event. It only matters how people respond to it. So that's why data is so important, because it continues this idea of the innovation cycle that we've talked about a couple of times, where you really only get better at this by understanding what happened when you did a certain thing. So I sent the press release out 2 days before the event and nothing happened. Okay, so that's maybe something that needs to change. There's a timeline cycle with these things. Or I charged $50 for an event and no one came. Maybe next time charging $20, or too many people came. Hundreds of people came at $20. Maybe I can charge more next time. This cycle of trying things out, testing, measuring, repeating, goes maybe more for marketing than anything else, because marketing, you're really trying to get some action to happen. And you don't always know what's going to get there. Are people really going to identify with the blogs that you do? Are they really going to identify with a podcast? Everyone's got a podcast. I guess we should have a podcast. But it only really matters on what happened when you did those things. So setting up some systems to help you do that, some data systems, I think is really key and really next level. And we'll talk about that more on the 28th. Um, yeah, this idea of customer relationship management, CRM. That's the acronym for the day. How do you manage your relationships with these people who, are in your network and that you want to be part of your family with your organization? Most of how we can help is through webinars. On branding things specifically. We do have some good customer tracking, donor tracking tools in the app that we're working on to make it easier for you to maintain relationships with your supporters. I'm thinking of changing the name of this from the 8-week academy to like a weekly webinar series. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. The number of people who have come to this, again, this is my like marketing, testing, adjusting. So I'd love to know your thoughts. Like, people are engaging for us for the first time at a point where we've only got like 2 of these workshops left. So I feel like I might start calling it the weekly webinar series instead of an 8-week academy. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I'd appreciate any feedback if you got it. Again, the Facebook forum, we've only got about a dozen people in there, but I think if you're looking for a place to have conversations with your peers and with experts about uh, whatever is going on with your organization, this, again, we're trying to build community around this. You can try that out, and yeah, we've got some tools in the platform that help keep track of your customers and your donors, that can be part of this data-based strategy to building relationships and building the organization. Next week, we're going to talk about program management. So how to really think about building a program that achieves their mission goals and is something that you can get people engaged about. Measuring impact is a kind of hot topic in the nonprofit world these days. So we'll talk a little bit about that and how you can come out seeming really ahead of the curve with that. Because it's something a lot of folks are working on, trying to figure out, how do you really measure the impact of, your art program or your education. It's a hard thing to really think about applying data to, but there's some good strategies for that. Questions? Okay, I'm